How's everybody doing today? So I'm not going to cover the Colorado gubernatorial race. And I'm not going to cover it because despite what a lot of people are saying it's not a toss-up. 10 minutes of research, we were able to conclude that this is not a toss-up race. D has this race, right? The Democrats have this race. But in doing my research for this race, I found out a few interesting things. And first off, let's talk about that statement that I just made. The Democrats have this race. It stands to reason, right, that the Democrats would have that race. When you think about Colorado, one of the first states to legalize recreational marijuana, a number of other things, Colorado seems like it would be a super progressive state. But in fact, that's not necessarily the case. And if we go back and look at the parties of the more recent governors, we do have a Democrat that's been in office for the last 4 years, Governor Bill Ritter. But before that, there was a Republican for 8 years, a Democrat for 12 years, a Democrat for 14 years, but then a Republican for 2 years, a Republican for 10 years. You get where I'm saying. They do go back and forth, at least on the governor's seat. So here's the thing. When I looked into the voter registration numbers for Colorado, I found out that they were actually a very high number of unaffiliated registered voters. As a matter of fact, as far as active voters are concerned, 36% of active voters in Colorado are unaffiliated. They are neither Democrat, Republican, or any other political party. When you look at what's registered or what's classified as inactive voters, that number is even higher at 45%. What's really interesting, though, is that even in one of the most highly unaffiliated states, right? Even in a state where unaffiliated voters outnumber either the Republican or Democratic Party, we can see that that number is actually on the rise, even percentage-wise, with 56% of voters who are in pre-registration being unaffiliated voters. I should say over 56%. It's actually closer to 57%, 56.71% of voters in pre-registration are unaffiliated. If I had to just off the top of my head give a guess as to why this is, I would attribute it to something of a schism within the Democratic Party. And as a matter of fact, the numbers seem to back up that theory. With 31%, or a little over 31%, of current registered voters in Colorado, current active registered voters in Colorado being Democrats, but only a little over 20% of new pre-registration voters being Democrats. So we can see that a large portion of the difference or the new increase in unaffiliated voters by percentage is coming out of the Democratic Party. As a matter of fact, the majority of it is. With Republicans and the smaller parties taking a little bit of a hit compared to their active voter numbers, but not nearly as much as the Democratic Party. And I think that a big portion of this schism is coming from progressives. I don't know what this will actually mean in the long run, especially when we consider the fact that people tend to trend towards being more right-leaning as they get older. Some of these voters might come more in line with and then register as Democrats later on. But when we look at the 2016 primary issues with Bernie Sanders, we can see that there is a huge divide in the political positions of a lot of more progressive Democrats and the main controlling groups of the Democratic Party, the more traditional Democrats. Now, the second issue I wanted to discuss and bring up that I found was interesting, that I learned from researching the Colorado gubernatorial race, is about fundraising amongst these same progressive candidates that we're talking about. People like Bernie Sanders, and in this particular case, people like Representative Jared Polis. Now, Polis is unequivocally a progressive liberal. And the thing about that is that he has suffered massively when it comes to fundraising. Now, why is that of note? Well, Polis is pretty solidly ahead in the polls and seems to have much more support from the voters than his opposition. So it would stand to reason that he would, in fact, have more opportunities for fundraising. And this is not something that is unique to Polis. It's also cited as a major issue in the governor's races of Maryland, Georgia, and Florida, who also have very progressive gubernatorial candidates as the Democratic nominee. It is of note that while progressive movements, progressive candidates seem to be gaining voter support, they are not gaining financial backing. Sorry for the abrupt scene change. And actually, real quick, I just want to kind of explain why the abrupt scene change. There is a little bit more information to this video that I'm going to get into right now. But in my zeal and somewhat frustration with the topic we're going to be discussing for the end of this video, I kind of went off half-cocked, and I said some things without verifying them. And when Maria was editing the video, she fact-checked some things, which is something that I've asked her to do. If there's something that I didn't cite a specific source for, and obviously she's doing a good job, because she came to me and she was like, some of the stuff is not correct. And so instead of trying to have her cut it up and make it look like I didn't say things that were incorrect, I thought it was a better idea to just shoot it with the accurate information. But back to the matter at hand. Jared Polis has substantially financed his own campaign, just in his party primary, to the tune of $11 million. This is something that is of note, and it's definitely one thing we can talk about. There are some interesting implications, because traditionally, if you go back and look at a video I did not too long ago, traditionally self-financing campaigns is kind of something that is way more prevalent amongst Republicans than amongst Democrats when you actually look at the number. But in the case of these progressives, this seems to be at least one of the avenues that they're turning to. The thing that I found interesting and of note, and the thing that I wanted to point out, because, look, I try and be nonpartisan, non-biased when I cover these political races. But the one thing that I hate more than anything, the one thing that really gets to me, is people who are disingenuous. It's just really not a good thing, especially when you're trying to campaign to hold a position where you will influence the lives of millions and millions of people. These progressives tend to run on the narrative that the 1% is evil, that wealthy people are the problem. But overwhelmingly, when we actually look, a lot of these progressives are themselves incredibly wealthy, and often even 1%ers. Now, Jared Polis is like the most extreme example of this, with a net worth of over $400 million. Jared Polis is like the 1% of the 1%. But other notable progressives are also 1%ers. Most importantly, probably, being Bernie Sanders, who's got a net worth of a little over $2 million and had an income in 2016 of $1 million plus, meaning that he more than double meets the requirement of being a 1%er. Andrew Gillum and Ben Jealous, the gubernatorial candidates, the progressive gubernatorial candidates for Florida and Maryland, respectively, have respective net worths of 334,000 and $250,000. While that's nowhere near the net worth of Bernie Sanders or especially Jared Polis, that's still nothing to scoff at. These guys are not by any means poor. Now, there are exceptions to this. Stacey Abrams, the gubernatorial candidate running in Georgia, who is also very progressive, has a net worth that is negative. In other words, she has more debt than she has assets. But she seems to be the exception and not the rule. And listen, I'm not saying that because somebody is wealthy, they can't support the poor. But when your narrative is that all of this evil is caused by the inherent greed of the 1%, and you're part of the 1%, and when your narrative calls for the redistribution of wealth so that these 1%ers need to give up their money and give it to the impoverished, well, maybe you should lead by example and redistribute your own wealth. I would be a lot more willing to back a candidate calling for the redistribution of wealth if I could see that this person had gone out of their way to redistribute their own vast fortune to needy and impoverished families. Jared Polis has enough money that if he were to redistribute his wealth in the literal sense and pay out a salary to 1,000 families with no other income for 1 year, he would have enough money to make those 1,000 families all 1%ers and still have enough left over that he wouldn't be starving. If for a more literal, reasonable example, if he were going to pay out a living wage he would be able to pay out a living wage to 8,000 different families, using the standard of a family of 4. He would be able to give 8,000 families of 4 a middle class income for a year. That type of thing to me just rings really false. The same is true with Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders, in a year where he made over $1 million, gave less than 4% to charity. That just kind of bothers me. That to me says I'm saying this because I think it's going to get me elected and not because it's what I'm actually going to believe in. I mean, it's really easy to say these other people should redistribute their wealth. These other people aren't deserving of their money when you're not offering to give your own money. But that's just my personal thoughts on it, and I wanted to share that with you. So without any further ado, you guys have a great night. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Engage with the videos, guys. I appreciate it. Engage with me in the comments section. If you say something that's not absurd, I'll happily respond to you. You guys have a great night, and peace.